After the Fact, a podcast by Pew, keeps it real with data-driven insights on today's big issues. No spin, just facts, mixed with stories from experts, policymakers, and people making a difference. Whether you're into the research or the personal stories behind it, we've got you covered. So what are you waiting for? Listen to After the Fact wherever you get your podcasts. Today on CityCast DC, a major shakeup could be coming to DC's approach to preventing violence. A new plan would consolidate the district's competing violence interruption programs under a single agency that has been at the center of a recent bribery scandal. But just what are these programs? The University of Maryland's Thomas Apt has spent years studying violence prevention, and he's here to explain how these efforts can and can't nudge violence downwards. Today is Thursday, March 27th. I'm Michael Schaefer, and here's what DC is talking about. Hey, Thomas.
Hey.
Thank you for being here.
It's my pleasure.
So you research violence reduction efforts, and maybe you can help us with a thing we have talked about a bunch on CityCast, which is that crime is finally down in DC after a few years of ticking continuously upwards, particularly murders, shootings, etc. And no one is quite sure why. What do you attribute the success to as someone who studies it?
Sure. Well, I think first of all, it's obviously good news. It's really gratifying to see rates of violent crime declining in the city after a number of years where they weren't. They were going in the opposite direction. That said, I think it's hard to tell what's going on. And I think you have to be mindful that violent crime, fortunately, is falling throughout the country. And we had a rather remarkable year last year. We're expected to, once all the numbers are in, to know that homicides declined by maybe 15% nationally. And so, there's a question of whether, DC is doing something especially well or whether DC is just going along with the national trend. DC still has a lot of violence and a lot more violence than the average city. So, a lot of work to be done.
So your own work has involved leading the charge on raising awareness of something called community violence program analyses, which you say go a long way towards making cities safer. Can we start with the most basic question? How do you define community violence?
Sure. So community violence is violence that happens in community settings. Sometimes it's known as street violence. It intersects with gang violence, gun violence, youth violence. But it's the everyday violence on the streets of our cities. And that form of violence accounts for the overwhelming majority of homicides every year in this country. It's the violence that causes the most deaths.
Wait, what are some non-community kinds of violence?
Domestic violence, school violence, workplace violence, mass shootings. We spend a tremendous amount of time, and obviously mass shootings are horrific events, but they account for less than 2% of all deaths every year.
So you're meaning like in a public place?
Right.
So these kinds of efforts have shown, if I understand it correctly, they've shown in the past that violence is really concentrated within a city to rather small, if you think of Washington as a city of 700,000 people, to a rather small number of people and places. How concentrated are we talking in the case of DC?
In the case of DC, they've done a problem analysis, and they've narrowed the problem down to anywhere between maybe 200 to 300 people. And that doesn't mean that every incident of violence is going to happen within this, range of 200 to 300 people. But it means that if you were to create a successful intervention to work with them, you would have a much bigger disproportionate effect because these are the folks who are at the highest risk for violence, both as perpetrators, but also as victims. That's something that's important to know in this space, is that today's victim could be tomorrow's perpetrator and vice versa, because a lot of this violence is retaliatory in nature.
So how do you compile these reports? And for that matter, how do you identify these 200-300 people?
Yeah, well, let me just take a step back because, I think folks might be wondering, well, why would you even do this analysis? One of the most important things to understand about community violence is that it's sticky. And what I mean by that is that it sticks together, clusters together in very small groups of people, places, and behaviors. So It's in a particular neighborhood, and for example, that folks might describe as dangerous. It's actually not uniformly dangerous. Typically, a dangerous neighborhood is a place that has two or three or more what I would call hotspots. And this is a well-known term in the criminal justice literature. And a hotspot is a surprisingly small location. Could be a single address, might be no more than 2 or 3 blocks. So what you need to focus on are these micro locations, a specific gas station, a specific housing project, a specific nightclub on a specific night. And in terms of people, one of the things that we know from the research is that even in the most allegedly dangerous neighborhoods, or actually dangerous neighborhoods, the vast majority of people, even in those neighborhoods, are still not dangerous. It's a small group of people who are disproportionately causing most of the violence, even in those neighborhoods. You got to do some kind of analysis to figure out who those people, places, and behaviors are. That's where this community violence problem analysis comes in. There's a lot of agreement that, if you don't do some type of analysis like this, you're essentially flying blind and you're not likely to be successful.
So I think, some people might look at this and say, wow, 300 people are going to be either victims of or perpetrators of a great disproportionate amount of the violence in the city. Why don't we, buy them all plane tickets to Tahiti and spot them a year of rent? And I have a feeling you're going to tell me it's a little more complicated than that.
Yeah, well, of course it is. They'd have to go voluntarily. You can't just deport them. And these are all residents of these places. And, people do move, but a lot of times they're there for a reason. They have connections, they have family and other things.
What's supposed to happen, ideally, after people, places, groups are identified?
So generally, the strategies that are most successful in this space are focused, balanced, and fair. They're focused in the way I just said. They're engaging the highest risk people, places, and behaviors. They're balanced in that they're setting up a set of incentives that are both negative and positive, punishments and rewards, carrot and stick, to maximize behavior change. So even with these most dangerous people, you're threatening punishments, you're threatening targeted investigation, arrest, prosecution, and even incarceration. But you're also offering supports and services. You're also saying, if you're willing to make a change, we can help you. Here are the various things that we can do for you. And so it's about arranging a set of punishments and rewards. It really maximizes the chances that some of these folks will leave the sort of business of violence or the lifestyle of violence behind voluntarily.
So DC did launch a violence prevention program in 2022. It was called People of Promise, and it was based on this idea of community violence program analyses. What was the plan there, and how was it meant to work out?
Well, it's a great story. I have to say, my understanding from the people who started the project, it was largely inspired by some of my work and the book I wrote, Bleeding Out, and the TED Talk I did on some of these things. And so they really tried to put those principles into practice, and they conducted this problem analysis, and they did it. But unfortunately, I think the People of Promise program sort of fell short on implementation. And they didn't set it up quite the way I think they should have. But I also think that even if they had delivered on it, it could have done some good as it was set up. But it failed in terms of implementation.
So 2022 was famously a year when violence was much higher. Specifically, what was it that wasn't implemented that caused this to fail, as best you can tell?
There's a few things. And some of it is just, they weren't able to put the pieces together to create a meaningful set of supports to really help people change their lives. I think they relied too much purely on government services and not enough on NGOs and not-for-profits who would have been more flexible and more agile and more nimble. And I think they fell down a bit in the messaging in terms of they let people know in advance, hey, there's this list of all these people we're going to help. And then they weren't able to get to all those people on the list. And the list was already out there. And so just, that wasn't a great way to communicate. But I think one of the things that I advised them early and fortunately, didn't get done is I said, look, if you're going to do this well, you really need to be partnering with law enforcement. And you need to understand that delivering services is half the equation. and it has to be balanced out with promises of accountability. And, what you really need to be able to do, and it's not easy for government to do this, I don't want to oversell it, is you really want to be able to engage with folks who are, in a pretty desperate situation and say, hey, you got to change. You can make a change for the better or you can make a change for the worse. But either way, you can't stay where you are.
This episode is brought to you by Prime Video. In the small town of Holland, Michigan, nothing is ever what it seems. Behind the tulip festivals and pretty houses lay dark secrets that threaten to tear a marriage apart. Nicole Kidman stars in this darkly twisted thriller about a wife and mother whose quest to uncover her husband's secrets may get her more than she bargained for. Holland, watch it now on Prime Video.
I can say to my new Samsung Galaxy S25 Ultra, hey, find a keto-friendly restaurant nearby and text it to Beth and Steve. And it does without me lifting a finger, so I can get in more squats anywhere I can. 1, 2, 3.
Will that be cash or credit?
Credit. 4.
Galaxy S25 Ultra, the AI companion that does the heavy lifting so you can do you. Get yours at Samsung.com. Compatible with select apps. Requires Google Gemini account. Results may vary based on input. Check responses for accuracy.
So we had previously interviewed Dr. Joseph Richardson, who's another violence intervention expert.
Yeah, he's a colleague of mine here at University of Maryland. Very smart.
So one of the things he told Bridget was that the lack of collaboration between public safety groups, a big part of the problem. I think a lot of people look at your work and might say like, oh my God, he's making lists of people. These people are going to be harassed illegally, unconstitutionally by the cops. They're going to have their rights violated. They're going to be targeted in ways that are unfair as a result of being on some list. And I don't want to do the kind of coordination you were just talking about. How do you sort of diffuse that skepticism?
Right. Well, you've got to be transparent about how these lists are created. And so you've got to say, look, we create these lists by, assembling a list of risk factors. And those risk factors are overwhelmingly based on a person's past behavior. And so when you look at DC's homicide victims and DC's homicide suspects, you get a very stable profile of these individuals. They're overwhelmingly men. They're between the ages of anywhere from 18 to 35. They're typically older than people suspected. The average age of a homicide offender in DC is like late 20s, early 30s. And the same for the average homicide victim. So most people think this is all about youth violence, which is not true. We do have a youth violence problem in DC, and it's getting worse. But it doesn't account for the majority of homicides in the city, not even close. So you've got these older individuals, and they're deeply involved in the criminal justice system. This isn't Minority Report. The community knows who these people are. Law enforcement knows. They've been in and out of the criminal justice system. And so what you're doing is you're simply operationalizing a way to engage the highest risk people who everybody knows is high risk and try to do something.
For people out there who aren't sci-fi readers, will you explain what this isn't Minority Report means?
Oh, Minority Report was a science fiction movie that was basically about these folks who, using science or super abilities or whatever, could predict the future. And they would say, oh, this person is going to commit a homicide in 5 years. And so they'd get arrested before they ever did anything. That's not what we're talking about here. When you're putting these lists together, you're doing it based on prior convictions, known affiliations with violent associations, gangs, groups, and cliques, and other things like that. And it just adds up. And so, it's not rocket science is what I'm saying. And so we need to take the mystery out of this. It's everybody who everybody already knows is involved in violence. It's just a more rigorous way of making sure that you're focused on those people. The average homicide victim in DC has more than 5 arrests and multiple convictions. And it's slightly higher for the average homicide perpetrator. So this isn't needles in a haystack stuff. This is just getting government to do the obvious thing kind of stuff.
Well, and that's the rub here, that it seems to me that one of the sort of recurring themes in talking about violence and efforts against violence in the district is that there's a lot of people who feel like the city or people doing it sort of don't put enough support into various violence intervention programs. And then those programs don't succeed as they should, and that discredits them. Do you think that's what went on with People of Promise?
I think it's more like what Joe said. I think there was breakdown in various parts of government. I know various parts of government didn't work well together. And it wasn't that the program failed because of a lack of inspiration. It was the perspiration, and it was the everyday leadership and management. I actually thought very highly of the director of that program, but she was hampered in a lot of ways from being effective. And so I think one of the things that's sort of tough about this work and why it's not always successful is you can have a good plan, but if you don't implement it well, you still won't be successful.
So you think it's worth trying again?
Yeah, well, also, I run the Center for the Study and Practice of Violence Reduction. We're working hand in hand with cities across the country. We're currently in 3 cities, St. Louis, Boston, and Knoxville. St. Louis, we've just gotten started, but in Boston and Knoxville, we've seen massive reductions in homicides and shootings with injury that are outpacing the national performance. And the reason is because with our help, they've been able to put strategies like this in place, strategies that are focused, balanced, and fair. You've got to focus on these high-risk individuals, and you have to engage them with a combination of accountability and empathy. And I think that's a sort of challenge in this space. People come to this work with strong prior political beliefs. And what I see people looking at the men who are locked in these cycles of retaliatory violence. And they either want to sort of portray them as sort of saints or sinners, and that they're either, horribly oppressed, deeply misunderstood, deeply stigmatized individuals, or they're monsters who had full agency, who nobody forced them to pick up the gun and these things. And of course, they're human beings. And we've got to find a way to sort of push back on those sort of extreme characterizations and see people as people. And that means both setting standards for behavior and holding people accountable for those standards, but it also means understanding how they got there in the first place and having some understanding and empathy about that.
My great fear with this fall in violence in DC, which I agree with you, it's very good news, is that, it takes it off the front page and then everyone sort of wrings their hands and says, we're back to normal. No need to bring urgency and creativity towards trying to sort out violence in DC or elsewhere. In the face of that, what do you say? Like these cities you just cited, what are they doing really well that other places are not doing?
Well, first of all, that fear is entirely justified. And that is how this works. I mean, one of the things that I say in my book is that we know how to reduce violence. Cities do it all, episodically all around the country. But very few cities do it sustainably. And it's because of precisely this issue. Look, talking about violent crime is a messy, ugly, dark business. And people generally don't want to do it. And they generally don't want to talk about it, especially politicians don't want to talk about it unless it's an absolute crisis. And as soon as it isn't an absolute crisis, they want to change the subject. And that's why you have this whiplash effect. Attention is broad. People hopefully apply the right evidence and data-informed strategies. They drive violence down. And then the urgency is lost. People move on. And those strategies atrophy. And then violence goes back up.
Especially with stuff like what you advocate, which, as you say, requires most people with strong ideologies to sort of drop some of their shibboleths, either viewing people as monsters or as victims.
Exactly. And, here's the good news and the bad news of violence reduction. The good news is we have strong science telling us that you can reduce violence without massive new budgets and without tons of new legislation. You can reduce violence and save lives with largely the constructs we have right now. The bad news is it takes significant behavior change on the ground by the people who are actually doing the work. And that is hard to do and then hard to sustain. And in the cities where we're being successful, we're a new center. We've only been working for about 3 years. Where we're successful, that's the conversation, which is how can you institutionalize this? How can we make sure that this work lives on past these few people who quote unquote get it and make sure that they train the next generation, et cetera, et cetera. And that's hard. That's hard to do.
But just to come back to Washington before I let you go, if we want to avoid this whiplash you just identified, what needs to happen next? Like, what do you hope we see in 2025?
What DC needs is it needs to come up with a plan and a vision for violence reduction that can be embraced by political leaders all across the city and can be communicated in a simple and straightforward way to the public. I always talk about focus, balance, and fairness. And then having described that plan, having gotten feedback and endorsement of that plan, then implement that plan. Once you've implemented that plan and you've had some success, then you've got to institutionalize it. And I wish I had sort of a bumper sticker that can tell you how to erase this, incredibly persistent and complicated sociocultural phenomenon, but I don't. It's about getting a good plan, executing it, and then memorializing it. And that takes leadership. And we need the leaders in the city to do that.
The other thing that's happening is we've got this heavily Democratic, mostly quite liberal city government, and it's actively coming face to face with a very outspokenly conservative, polarized Congress that has made a big issue out of crime and has very different ideas about how to reach a solution. That aspect makes this sort of sales job you're talking about a little more tricky.
I think that's very true. The solutions to crime and violence you can't sort of pick them out of the typical progressive or conservative talking points. They're somewhere in the middle. They're technocratic. And what we need people to do is create a safe space and say, look, we're going to disagree politically about lots of different things, but we should be able to agree that we want to keep people safe. And let's create a safe space here where we let research, we let data, we let common sense, and we let facts determine our decisions and not just make it a political football that we toss back and forth. That's what I hope. That's what I'll be, pushing and urging publicly. We'll see what happens.
Hey, thank you so much for being here.
My pleasure.
And that's all for today here on CityCast DC. If you enjoyed the show, why not tell a friend, rate the show, leave us a review, and subscribe to our morning newsletter. We'll be back tomorrow morning with more news from around the city. Bye.